The general consensus is that the intended audience for BoJack is college students, which is a pretty broad net to cast. If you think about that, who does that include? People generally from the age of 18 to 25. But we know that BoJack has resonated with more people than just that. Was The Sopranos also intended for college students? Was Breaking Bad? With the introduction of bottomless TV through Netflix, Hulu, and other sources, the act of binge-watching has made that broad audience net even bigger. It's only in the past 10 or so years that a noticeably younger audience has watched The Sopranos. I feel like that the 28 to 45-year-old audience is actually the true audience of these things. I feel like BoJack being in cartoon form has played a part in younger audience involving themselves in what would otherwise be considered dad TV. If anybody actually knows the name of the 28 to 45-year-old demographic, please leave a comment below, because I couldn't find anything that specifically named that demographic. So while the broader intended audience for BoJack is the multifaceted college student, I consider BoJack's core intended audience being midlife denizens of LA and Hollywood, people involved in that culture who get the jokes, who live that life, and who would actually benefit the most from the introspection that Bob Waxberg has to give. The visuals for the intro to the series change with each season but follow the same formula, like any good anime does. The opening credits is supposed to be an average BoJack day, but encompasses the whole season. It doesn't show us exact scenes from the different episodes, but shows us clues that give a sense of presence. We see Todd knocking over melons in the market, while the paparazzi flash their cameras. Another thing in the opening credits is that we can see Andy Warhol artwork that hangs above BoJack's bed, and the framed TV guides that BoJack collected. Warhol's famous quote, "We all get our 15 minutes of fame," really rings true in BoJack's life, who stumbled into his 15 minutes and tries desperately to hang on to them. Right away it opens with a joke clarifying BoJack's rude and arrogant nature, showing us how this character presents himself publicly. Although BoJack comes off as an a-hole, because he is very inconsiderate, it is a mirror of how most celebrities wish they could act. Some celebrities pretend to disagree with their peers' irrational behavior simply for the ego boost. This isn't to say that Raphael Bob Waxberg is one of those people, but he's showing us what he sees and interprets that kind of behavior as. Right after the opener and introduction, we're given the main premise of the season, which is that BoJack is having a book written about him. He claims he can do it himself, so we already have a pretty good idea of who Season 1 BoJack is. Vain, cyclical, stupid, and selfish. More than the typical washed-up actor, he is someone who only exists by reacting to himself. People compare him to Charlie Sheen or Matthew Perry, which makes sense on the surface level, but it's more accurate to say that if BoJack's father is a failed version of Charles Bukowski, BoJack is like a failed version of Hunter S. Thompson, without any of the journalistic integrity. The truth of that matter is simply that BoJack's story and life isn't based on anyone's, because it doesn't mirror anybody else's story. Bob Waxberg has said himself BoJack is based on his own thoughts and feelings after standing on a mansion balcony in LA, looking out over the city that had endless possibilities, but nowhere for him to go and no one for him to see. It's a myth in a way, which is why Bob Waxberg has also said that BoJack is based after other fictional things, such as Californication, and specifically the sad episodes of The Simpsons. BoJack is based off a feeling of melancholic, almost bitter loneliness, knowing that you have had all these experiences and all these things that support your lifestyle, but not being pleased or fulfilled by any of it. Todd is introduced as BoJack's first voice of reason. When Todd is away from BoJack, he has a life of his own and acts almost childlike, but his role in BoJack's life is to be mature and almost a caretaker in some instances. Otherwise, Todd unintentionally becomes someone who enables BoJack's own childishness. This is already reflective of the tensions that Todd and BoJack have through their relationship. And in Todd, we eventually get to see how that self-awareness and maturity is the seed to his independence. We're first introduced to Mr. Peanut Butter and Princess Carolyn by way of flashback. On first watch-through, I actually liked Mr. Peanut Butter, but after watching BoJack multiple times, I don't really care for him all that much. That is to say, I think he's tolerable in the same way BoJack is tolerable. He's the type of guy that relies on being the kind of guy that you want to like you. Like, my desire to see him as a good guy is totally based off of whether or not I care if he likes me, and I don't care whether or not he likes me. I can see how he can use that as a tool. My dislike isn't an assumption that he will do bad things or is a villain on purpose, but since he's supposed to be BoJack's foil, there's just no way to see him as purely good, and over time he does show his true colors. He ignores the things that don't respond to him in the way that he would like. Hiding your misery until it comes out on its own doesn't make you a better person than someone who is more open about their pain. And a friend to everybody is a friend to no one. Princess Carolyn is someone who is introduced as being very concerned about public image, very goal-oriented, and who is in the middle of breaking up with BoJack in the flashback. Ultimately, she makes it clear that she's walking away because she wants a baby, but BoJack doesn't. People can choose to be childless, but it's clear that BoJack's refusal to truly commit to Princess Carolyn comes from the fact that he doesn't really love her. Their relationship was born out of convenience and truly Princess Carolyn's inability to say no. Her being BoJack's manager and being in a relationship with him is an abuse of power on her part. Although Princess Carolyn prides herself on being able to separate her personal life from her work, we quickly see that that's not true, because if it was, her personal life and her work would not have been mixed in the first place. In this flashback scene is also the first clear foreshadowing in the form of Mr. Peanut Butter saying, "Always a Clydesdale, never the Clyde, eh, BoJack?" You'll get that later. As a side note, one thing I thought was funny is that we see BoJack's character in Horsing Around was literally named The Horse, which I took as being a joke for being about celebrities meeting their fans outside, but the fans forgetting the movie characters' names. Like celebrities getting stopped by fans, and the fans will say, "Aren't you the guy from so-and-so?" It's funny that BoJack's character was literally the horse. And although it's a funny joke, it also makes me dislike Mr. Peanut Butter that much more because his character's name was Mr. Peanut Butter, so he always gets referred to by his name. I feel like Mr. Peanut Butter's house has a Pee-wee's Playhouse type of vibe to the name. I also think it's interesting that people think Horsing Around had a Full House vibe when Mr. Peanut Butter's house clearly actually did. Mr. Peanut Butter seems way more reflective of Boz Saget to me than BoJack does, simply for the fact that he puts on a friendly face to everyone on the outside, but is so emotionally immature and stunted behind the scenes, he's probably, and is, a predatory jerk. The whole flashback scene also shows that Mr. Peanut Butter and Princess Carolyn embody the Hollywood personality that is more or less necessary to have to really survive in that industry, and BoJack doesn't. BoJack is very codependent in many ways, and wouldn't last by himself. Diane is introduced to us at Penguin Publishing as the person who wrote the biography of Secretariat. I think it's interesting that the only main characters we are directly introduced to in the first episode is BoJack and Todd. This also happens in the first episode of The Sopranos when we're introduced to Tony's family. Diane, having written the book on Secretariat, is the next big piece of foreshadowing in this episode. There is a controversy over the voice actress for Diane, and the way that the jokes about her last name in this first episode are written kind of makes me wonder if Bob Waxberg, or whoever the hiring people were, purposefully avoided hiring an Asian American actress to voice her, just so these types of jokes could be written without them feeling guilty. Like, the joke is there to say, look at how ignorant and racist this character is, but I feel like that there's a difference between a controversial joke told in the appropriate environment to the right audience, and a controversial joke told to an audience who is too far removed from the reality of a situation, that the disrespect outweighs relatability. Victims can laugh at their own oppression, but it's pretty uncomfortable and leads to defensive behaviors when the oppressor tries to make the victim laugh at their own oppression. That's why until you know someone pretty well, it's generally not a good idea to poke fun at sensitive subjects, unless you'd actually like to come across like you're sympathetic towards oppression. Otherwise, you're relying on the other person to come to the conclusion organically that you just didn't mean it like that, and that's kind of asking a lot from abused people who don't owe you any benefit of the doubt. I feel like people in Hollywood treat acknowledging bad things as a joke in itself. BoJack ends up having multiple panic attacks, just like Tony does in the first episode of The Sopranos. It's played off for laughs at first, but it shows how fragile he really is, like BoJack can't place a phone call or work on anything without breaking down. A running theme in BoJack is that he exudes so many symptoms of unresolved trauma, but nobody ever really takes it seriously. It alludes to the truth that when you act that way, you affect multiple people over time, but the only constant suffering is yours. Multiple people over time can alleviate fragments of that suffering, but using people and places as distractions is not the same as deciding for yourself who to be around or where to go. The thing with BoJack that will be discussed multiple times is that he doesn't have a mature voice due to neglect and trauma. That means he is codependent, impulsive, indecisive, and cyclical. He doesn't know what to say no to or what to agree to, although he's smart enough to have the capability to develop his own voice. He's never offered that patience that others have grown up with. When his mother and father should have been helping him reach those milestones as a growing boy, they neglected him and showed him that the only way to speak to people was down to them in a very critical way. And we'll continue to discuss how his father's absence and his mother's own trauma affected him. BoJack is never given a fair chance to say how he feels, so when the moments for him to do so come, they go just as quickly because he is underprepared for it. Just as if he was auditioning for a part he would be perfect for, but forgot the lines on stage when it mattered the most. In this episode, Mr. Peanut Butter asks BoJack at the party how he's feeling, and BoJack struggles to find the words as Mr. Peanut Butter walks away, and this perfectly illustrates that point. A larger point that I have emphasized while analyzing this show is that everyone treats BoJack the same way BoJack's mother treats him. And you'll notice it in your own life too, that the ways that people will hurt you tend to be the same action through a different face. That means you have to quit reacting to it in the same way. That being said, BoJack sees his friendship with Mr. Peanut Butter as a rivalry, a trait that he shares with Princess Carolyn. They make up rivalries in their heads because their sense of identity revolves around their definition of success. BoJack doesn't like how Mr. Peanut Butter jokes about cheating on Diane even though he was actively cheating on Princess Carolyn, because in his mind he sees himself as someone who would be faithful if things went his way. He would be good to the right person. This gives him a way to blame the other person when he does decide not to be faithful anymore, even though the affected person had nothing to do with that decision. Again, just someone so wrapped up in themselves that they can only react to themselves. And this episode ends with BoJack getting what he wants, but at a price. And we'll see, that's a pretty common theme.